Ladies and gentlemen, honoured guests, it's time now for our last panel of the day. So if I might ask you all to take your seats and carry on your conversations by text message like good millennials, that would be marvellous. The topic of our final panel is the new old Cold War, and it will be moderated by Professor Jeffrey Kaplan, the Distinguished Fellow of the Danube Institute and an author of more than 24 books. Taking part in the panel, Dr. Maria Engström, Professor of Russian at Uppsala University, Sweden. Mr. David Satter, an author and producer and specialist on Russia. Dr. George Bogdan, the Olin Fellow at Columbia University and a senior visiting researcher at Bard College. John Venable, the Senior Research Fellow of Defense Policy at the Heritage Foundation, and, as we said, Dr. Jeffrey Kaplan, moderating the whole shooting match. So, if I may, over to you.
Thank you. As a historian, I'm very pleased that a new old Cold War panel is included in the third Danube Geopolitical Summit. In both media and the academic literature, much has been said about the emergence of a new Cold War, or for some, the reemergence of the Cold War itself in Europe. Especially after the invasion of Ukraine, once again, Russia stands against the West. But on a deeper level, the world of the 21st century is far different from the world of the 20th century. The world is no longer bipolar in structure. While by most objective standards, both Russia and the United States are in decline. The broad policy consensus that marked most Western nations in the last century is very much a thing of the past. While sources of news, information, and disinformation have proliferated. There are no longer authoritative voices in media or in politics. China has now emerged as a global power. But the most striking continuity between the Cold War and the current situation is that Russia once again has invaded a nearby country in a manner that was both ill-conceived, abysmally planned, and once again making clear on the world stage the remarkable ineptitude of the Russian military. So much has changed, but in some fundamental ways. To quote four of the great philosophers of the Cold War era, Led Zeppelin, the song remains the same. Our distinguished panel will explore these issues with far greater insight than I could offer. We begin with Professor Maria Engström, whose work on Russian political theology, especially as focused on the concept of the catechon, has been a great influence on my own understanding of Russia. Professor Engström.
Can you hear me? Yeah, good. It's good to be here at the Danube Institute, so thank you for inviting me for the second time here. And my talk today, it is my new project, the civilizational turn in Russian foreign policy, so it is just the beginning of this new project, and I'll be happy to answer your question and discuss this after our presentations. So, Vladimir Putin's Munich speech of 2007 and the global financial crisis of the following year marked the beginning of the conservative turn in Russian politics and culture. A defining feature of this turn is the normalization of the civilizational narrative, which casts doubt on the universality of the Western liberal world order and affirms the possibility of non-Eurocentric cultural, economic, and political subjectivities. An anti-Western, multi-civilizational approach was promoted by the Kremlin for more than a decade, but the concept of Russia as a state civilization is explained for the first time in the 2023 foreign policy concept. Its proponents see this doctrine as an alternative to the doctrine of American exceptionalism and as an important ideological tool for openly challenging Western hegemony and creating a new polycentric world order. So how did the concept of civilization, regarded by many as a theoretical construct of the past, end up in Russian legislation, in a document where Russia communicates its understanding of the international landscape and its national interest. In this presentation, I will try to analyze the development of the civilizationist discourse as a tool for conservative identity construction in post-Soviet Russia, and explain why the doctrine of Russia as a civilization makes a useful conceptual foundation of Russia's new foreign policy in the current conflict with the West. So, in February 2022, Russian leaders decided to close the window to the West, which Peter the Great opened for 300 years ago, and start a new geopolitical, geoeconomic, and geocultural project, which they define as the civilizational one. This is a radical revolution in Russian history. The sanctions and the Western project of Russia cancelling helps the ruling elite to shape this new civilizational project. The new 2023 foreign policy concept states that Russia is, as a state civilization, this is for the first time, a supranational union of different peoples brought together by a common civilizational identity. So, I will not read the whole thing, but you can see the quotation here. It's a unique civilization state that brings together the Russian people and other peoples belonging to the cultural and civilizational community of the Russian world. So Russia as a civilization is imagined as a locally fixed center and potentially boundless periphery. I can quote again, civilizational community of the Russian world, as a hierarchy of various groups and cultures with the Russian culture at the very top. The civilizational model of societal vision is open in contrast to the idea of nation. Russia is ready to incorporate other peoples and cultures, provided they recognize the primacy of the Russian culture and Russian peoples as the backbones of the state. Putin's famous declarations that, I quote, Russia's borders do not end anywhere, is the epitome of this civilizational imagination. So this civilizationist discourse requires a new state-controlled memory politics, a new level of control over the media, education, culture, and science. All these processes are in place in contemporary Russia. The civilizationist discourse is now the base of mandatory ideological education, which is making a comeback in Russia's higher education systems. This for the first time after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So since September 1st this year, so just 3 weeks ago, the course, which is called Foundations of Russian Statehood, Основы российской государственности, is a mandatory course in all of Russia's university. And this course consists of 5 parts, and every young adult in Russia that goes to university has to do this course. So you see the questions and this what is discussed there. I can show you the aims and objectives of this course. So it's all about Russia, not as a nation, but as a civilization. The concept of civilization is not a new tool for identity construction, but in Russian case, this civilizational talk demonstrates a specific dialectic of domestic and foreign policy aspects. Before the idea of Russia as civilizations entered the Russian political leadership's vocabulary in the mid-2000s, this ideology was advocated by various public intellectuals, academics, writers, artists, and journalists. I skip the European part of it. So, the idea of Russia as a unique civilizational community is not new. It's the main idea of Russian geopolitical school, which is not limited to the well-known figure of Alexander Dugin, but it includes the legacy of the 19th century political philosopher Nikolai Danilevsky, the Eurasianism of the 20s, as well as contemporary thinker Vadim Tsimbursky, the author of the geopolitical concept Island Russia. Regarding the intellectual and cultural components of post-Soviet civilizational discourse, we may delineate 3 coexisting alternatives. These civilizations projects are united by their critical relationship to the cultural and political hegemony of Western neoliberalism and its woke culture, but among themselves there are a number of significant differences. So the first one may be termed as Russia as Europe. It is the image of Russia as the real, true Europe, as the protectress of Christian values. And this orientation implies proximity to conservative elites in the West. The second path may be termed Russia as Eurasia. The salient elements in this paradigm are a critical view of Eurocentrism, of course, and reactualization of Soviet heritage, and a proximity to the global South. And I should say that this alternative is the one that dominates Russian political discourse now. The third part is what we can call Russia as Russia. This is an articulation of the idea of Russian uniqueness and civilizational peerlessness. In this project, Russia is a pariah and a bearer of great potential. And I like two previous strategies of civilizational development. This variant is the least developed within contemporary Russian conservative thought, but hails from a great, very rich tradition in the Russian religious imagination. Like here you see a picture from Konstantin Gorbatov, which depicts Russia not as an island, but as an arc. And this is another example of this imagination. So, according to Vadim Tsimbursky, whom I mentioned, contemporary Russian geopolitical thinker, any civilization is arranged according to the principle of the sacred vertical. The community that composes the center of the civilization is represented as a bearer of some specific ideas and cultural practices that match the transcendental destination of mankind. So what is the sacred vertical or ontological project, universal purpose of Russia as civilization, according both to Russian intellectual tradition and to official documents such as the foreign policy concept? In the Russian cultural and political imagination, the universal purpose of Russia, its messianic destiny, is formulated in the following way. It is to stop any other civilization's attempt to impose its ontological project on other civilizations. So, this is the history. Today, it is the West, Anglo-Americans, the US mostly. In the 20th century, it was Germany. In the 19th, France, and so on. So, according to the concept of Russian exceptionalism, Russia is the Christian katechon, the last remaining power on earth that can withhold the arrival of the Antichrist and the commencement of the apocalypse. The current struggle between Russia and the West is often described, not only by Dugin, but by Putin himself, in an apocalyptic mode. Like a last war, a last battle, or a war of civilizations. According to this new foreign policy concept, Russia's mission in international relations is defined as a camp against Western neocolonialism and expansion. The Kremlin now uses this old new anti-colonial narrative of resistance to the Western hegemony and positions itself as a global leader of this new anti-colonial revolution, thereby laying a claim to a part of the Soviet legacy. So I just quote from the concept, humanity is currently going through revolutionary changes. Next, about the West. These countries, meaning the West, refuse to recognize the realities of a multipolar world and to agree on the parameters and principles of the world order accordingly. And the third quotation is about Russia's role. Russia is one of the sovereign centers of global development, performing a historically unique mission aimed at maintaining global balance of power and building a multipolar international system. So, how all this explains Russia's view on the war? So, according to this, to the described civilization ideology, the current war in Ukraine is an existential war that will decide Russia's future as a civilization. It is a war with the West, and not a cold one. It's a hot war. And I quote from Sergei Lavrov from 4 days ago, who said, "No matter what it says, it's the United States control this war. It supplies weapons, munition, intelligence information, and data from satellites. It is pursuing a war against us." Typologically, it is a new 30 years war. That's how Russian experts see it. So it's just the beginning of a long war, maybe 30 years, maybe 100 years. The war that will profoundly alter the global political landscape, shift balance of power, and define the future world order. Thank you.
Professor David Sater is a distinguished historian and commentator on Russian affairs who spent much time in the old Soviet Union as a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. He's written several important books, of which for non-specialists, the massive 700-page Never Speak to Strangers is perhaps the best introduction to the time and the place that can be found. Dr. Sutter.
Just one note, I was correspondent of the Financial Times, not the Wall Street Journal.
Never trust the internet.
No, I contributed to the Wall Street Journal for many years. In fact, they never had me on their salary. They got a good deal. Anyway, I'm very glad to be here. I want to talk about the background to the war, which is, of course, the topic that I think really concerns everyone here, and forms the background to our discussion on a variety of issues. It's no surprise to anyone that in the initial stages of the phase of the war that began on February 24th, 2022, there was a lot of unanimity and solidarity with Ukraine because of the obvious injustice of an unprovoked murderous attack on a sovereign country. But with the passage of time, we also are aware that support for Ukraine has diminished for various reasons. Some people have said that in the United States, at least, that sending weapons to Ukraine is too expensive. It distracts us from other priorities that we should have at home. Some people have repeated the Russian version that Ukraine is not really a country. Governor DeSantis, the Florida governor, said that what was at stake is a border conflict, as if the internationally recognized borders of a country are in dispute. What I would like to do is review the history of the conflict. The reason for that is simple. I think if we understand where this conflict came from, we will also understand what our obligations as citizens of the West are, what's at stake in this confrontation, what kind of sacrifices are justified. I think that I've been following these events for decades, and what bothers me more than anything else is that this was an easily preventable war for reasons that I'm about to explain. And what I would not like to see is a situation in which a war that we could have prevented and didn't ends up being a defeat that we could have avoided but chose not to. In the first place, it has to be borne in mind that Ukraine is an independent, sovereign country, no less so than Russia itself. It was subsumed under the Russian Empire, but when the Russian Empire fell apart in 1917, after the Bolshevik seizure of power, those forces that were committed to establishing a communist state were concerned to give all of the constituent people of the Russian Empire who had been subjected to Russification the impression that they were going to be liberated. Under those circumstances, when this country known as the Soviet Union was constituted in 1923, it was constituted as an agglomeration or a collection of sovereign nations. And one of those sovereign nations was Ukraine. These nations were united not by nationality, but by the fact that they were all socialist. In other words, the old policy which characterized the Russian Empire of Russification, of suppressing national identity and culture and suppressing language, was abandoned, and in its place was put the imposition of the communist system. Suddenly, it became acceptable to take pride in your national identity, to take pride in your language, to practice your culture, but you had to do it within the framework of Marxist-Leninist ideology. So in other words, you could read Marx and Lenin now in 80 different languages, but you couldn't read anything else. When Gorbachev began the policy of glasnost in the late 1980s, it was directed, first of all, against the ideology. The ideology had created such a stranglehold on the progress and life of the country that so-called liberals in the Soviet system thought that by lessening the hold of the ideology, it would be possible to liberate the energy of the Soviet people. In other words, to get a slave to behave like a free man, but have him remain a slave. Of course, it didn't work. No matter how much liberalization was introduced into the system, it wasn't enough to rejuvenate that system and make the people of the Soviet Union behave as if they were citizens of the West. But most important, in the process, the ideology became progressively dismantled, and a vacuum was created a spiritual vacuum actually was created in the society. A space was opened up for truthful information in a world that had been based entirely on lies. Well, obviously something had to give. Either the space of freedom and truthfulness had to be destroyed, or the system based on lies would collapse, and it was the latter that happened. And into the vacuum that was created emerged genuine nationalism. Soviet Union was never a real country. Ukraine, Russia, Armenia, Georgia, the other republics that constituted the Soviet Union, those are real countries. Soviet Union was a technique of force. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, there were referenda in the various national republics. In the case of Ukraine, the vote was overwhelmingly in favor of independence, as it was in Russia itself, and as it was in other of the republics. And that includes not just the areas that were Ukrainian-speaking, but the Russian-speaking areas as well, and the Crimea, which, by the way, voted not overwhelmingly, but by a sizable majority for independence. In the following years, Ukrainian independence was accepted by Russia. And there were more than 250 treaties signed between Russia and Ukraine, all of them based on the territorial integrity of Ukraine. In 1997, Ukraine and Russia signed a friendship treaty, which affirmed the borders of Ukraine, including Crimea as part of Ukraine. The relationship between the two countries was affirmed in 2012. 2002. I'm trying to get these dates right. By Putin, who specifically said that Ukraine had the right to become a member of NATO. And this was in a press conference with the president of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma. It's on the Kremlin website, because it was an independent country. The final agreement between Russia and Ukraine was an agreement over the price of gas, because Russian gas reached the West through Ukrainian pipelines. Russia was obliged to pay transit fees, and in return for supplying Ukraine itself with gas at a discounted price, the Ukrainians agreed that Russia could continue their lease for the Black Sea Fleet on the naval base in Sevastopol. Well, that agreement, of course, became null and void after the Russians invaded Crimea and just simply took it over. So, under these circumstances, what is it that motivated Russia to attack a sovereign nation with which it had had peaceful relations and whose separate identity it officially recognized for more than at least 25 years. And that was what happened in Russia itself, the criminal takeover of the country that calls itself the Russian Federation, but is not a federation. It's like the People's Republic of China, which is not a People's Republic, or the Democratic Republic of Korea. But in any case, when the Soviet Union fell, there was a tremendous moral and intellectual challenge that was posed to the peoples of the former Soviet Union. They had to abandon the notion of class values as the determinant of behavior in favor of universal values. The philosophy of the Soviet Union was that right and wrong were determined by what was in the interest of the historically most progressive class. That class was the proletariat, supposedly represented by the Communist Party, represented in turn by the Communist Party leadership, and represented by a single dictator. That was only possible through the establishment of the rule of law. I mean, Adam Smith defined the market as equivalent exchange. I give you something, I get something in return, but they're of equal value. An equivalent exchange is impossible without the framework of ethics and law. It was the absence of such a framework that determined Russian history, and it was the absence which was the most difficult thing for the West to understand about Russia. Instead, Russia embarked not on establishing law, but on establishing a capitalist economy as quickly as possible, putting property in private hands. And they didn't care particularly in whose hands the property was placed. If they were criminals, well, they were socially friendly, whereas people who objected to such an indiscriminate distribution of the nation's wealth were historically retrograde. The result was that Russia was basically turned over to criminals. Under Yeltsin, the criminal was king. The people we call oligarchs, they were in fact those who were the most adept at stealing the property that was created by the combined efforts of the entire population. And the result for the country was radical impoverishment. Russia, during the 1990s, witnessed a fall in the national income of 50%, which did not occur even under Nazi occupation. The demographic loss in the population, as people simply died from every imaginable health condition as well as psychological despair, was 6 million. That's unprecedented for an industrial country in peacetime. So obviously, Yeltsin was a very poor candidate to succeed himself in the year 2000, or to be able to select his successor. Well, I was in Moscow in the summer of 1999. New elections were coming, and there was a sense the atmosphere was extremely heavy because people understood that something big was going to take place. We didn't really know what, but everyone expected some type of provocation. It was then that apartment buildings in Russia began to be blown up. The Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin, someone who was completely unknown, promised revenge. He became the most prominent person in the country, was on television constantly, started a war against the breakaway Republic of Chechnya, and on the strength of that war, and his role as avenging the terrorist act against the Russian people, became the Russian president. It was later transpired that all evidence showed that those bombings were carried out by the Russian security services themselves. But it was that incident that created the conditions for the war that we have now. Because a group of people who came to power as a result of a terrorist act against their own population were permanently vulnerable. And as a result, we're constantly in the position of having to resort to external attacks in order to cement their hold on power. And that's where we stand now. The war in Ukraine was an attempt to do just that, to strengthen the hold on power of a small kleptocratic group. And the decision that we'll have to make for the future is whether or not such a regime should be allowed to expand its hold and continue to strengthen itself on the basis of foreign aggression, not just against Ukraine, but against its other neighbors as well. Under these circumstances, I think that the choice for the Western world becomes quite clear, and the safeguarding of the members of the NATO alliance and of Russia's neighbors does require the steps that we've taken and the solidarity that the Ukrainians need and desire.
Being more careful in my introduction this time, if the internet is to be believed, Dr. George Bogdan is or has been a fellow at such influential think tanks as Heritage, the Wilson Center, the Kennan Institute, the Krauthammer Fellowship, MCC Hungary Foundation, the Yorktown Institute, the George Marshall Fund, the Olin School of Law, and this is only the first page of a Google search. My tattered self-esteem did not allow me to open the second page. Dr. Bogdan.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. I really appreciate that very kind introduction. I guess what I have to do first is respond to your fantastic allusion about what we might be dealing with today. You mentioned Led Zeppelin. And I would say that another way to conceptualize what I think this panel is getting at is the Hotel California, in the sense that we can check out from the Cold War, but can we ever leave? Oh, I see.
I'm too old for that.
Yeah. But I mention that just because I think that when this kind of debate takes place, there's often a tendency to want to talk about the return or the recrudescence or something of that sort, maybe Game of Thrones season 2. But really, I think what might be more valuable is to think about continuities and discontinuities. And to do that today, I want to give you a brief vignette of diplomatic history. I'm writing a book right now about the Budapest Memorandum, which is the agreement that Mr. Libby spoke about this morning very briefly. But that was the final agreement after a series of negotiations and agreement that led Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons. But rather than focusing on Ukraine, I want to focus on another case, which I'll get to in just a minute. And so the case that I want to focus on today is the case of Belarus, because Belarus also gave up nuclear weapons. And I want to take just a kind of brief moment during this panel to narrow our gaze to something that did survive the Cold War, which is nuclear weapons, nuclear technology, where nuclear weapons are placed, and the strategy by which states apply deterrence in seeking to use what military utility nuclear weapons might have. So there's a great deal of complexity in the comparisons that we're making today, but I'm going to try to just deal with one kind of element that might be under consideration. Before I do that, though, I want to kind of orient everyone to the geography of what we're discussing today. I find this map endlessly interesting because it shows where the Soviet Union really at the end of its time had placed nuclear weapons. And of course, for today's purposes, we're most interested in Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine. Just remarkable how many different installations there were. And if an exchange between Gorbachev's advisor, Yakovlev, and President George H.W. Bush in November of 1991 is to be believed, it was 30% of the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons and missiles that were outside of its territory. There are different kind of estimates. Some people say 25%, but you get the idea of what I'm talking about here. Now, what do I mean by naming this discussion old business? What I mean by that, and I really want to foreground this in the conversation, is that as you transition between the administrations that had to deal with this question of what was going to happen with the old Soviet nuclear arsenal outside of the Russian Federation's territory, you have the development of this phrase of old business. Strobe Talbot, President Clinton's Deputy Secretary of State, complained to Secretary of State Warren Christopher, why don't we get credit for this? This is, people treat this like we're just cleaning up the Cold War. And then in another exchange between President Clinton and President Yeltsin, they talk about, the old business of nuclear arms, and that really we've come to this consensus. If we can just get the number of nukes down and the number of states with nuclear weapons lower, the world will be a much more stable place. Now, many people, I think, would approach those ideas as kind of a baseline for, rational thinking about nuclear weapons. But one person that I interviewed really sparked my interest in questioning some of the kind of underlying assumptions that might be embedded in that. And that person was Ambassador Volker, who was actually present in Budapest, in this city, when the Budapest Memorandum was signed. And he urged me to think critically about how Russian leaders at the end of the Soviet Union and the beginning of the Russian Federation may have acted opportunistically, how they may have mouthed the idiom of non-proliferation in order to achieve a strategic advantage. And so that's what I want to talk briefly about today. As I said, we're going to talk a little bit about Belarus's case. And I couldn't help but put this remarkable email on the right, on the slide, because this is the United States' current Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, writing to his boss at the time, Tony Lake, saying, oh my goodness, Now Belarus has gotten its nukes out of its territory and back into Russia. We have to celebrate this. It's a big achievement for the administration, right? And so, it's a remarkable email for several reasons. There you see Tony Lake's kind of customary signature with a cheerful star on it. But what I think this email gets at is the sense at the time that there was this momentum behind nonproliferation that was extremely kind of influential within the administration. And so the following day, the White House actually did precisely what Lake is proposing in this email, right? They put out a statement saying this is a great achievement for humanity. What I want to note, however, is this strange paradox in what took place. And that paradox is that of the three countries that had Soviet nuclear weapons on their territory, Belarus actually had the smallest number, right? By many factors, okay? But strangely, it was the last country to remove those weapons from its territory. Why did it do this? Why did it take so long? What was taking place? So that's what I think can shed some light on today. To understand what took place, I think we have to kind of go step by step. And really what we see in the exchange between the United States and Belarus is a bizarre episode in which President Lukashenko ascends to the presidency the same year the Budapest Memorandum is signed. And shortly after that, the following year, President Yeltsin begins what became a pattern of describing the border between Belarus and Russia as being basically non-existent, right? And shortly after that, Lukashenko starts to say, well, maybe we should go back on the Budapest Memorandum. Maybe we should actually keep these nuclear weapons on our territory. And although the Russian government never endorsed that idea, it also never contradicted it for about 18 months. And so this provoked a very serious response from various actors in Western Europe. At the time, NATO expansion was being debated, and countries like Poland began to say, well, we're prepared as potential members of NATO to have American missiles on our territory. And so when this psychodrama began to spiral out of control, the defense minister of Russia, Pavel Grachev, actually released this map, which is a stunning map. And it appeared all over the Russian press, and it demonstrates what a joint nuclear attack on Europe from Russia and Belarus would look like. Now, this is after the Cold War had concluded, and so this is an extremely provocative thing to appear, right? But what happened after that, I think, is even more important, because after this kind of exchange of threats and intimidation took place, what you began to see was a kind of series of statements from NATO and its leadership. And at the time, Javier Solana actually began to say, we have no interest, will, or reason to place nuclear weapons in new member states of NATO, right? And this statement was eventually codified in the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And after he stated that, Russia then finally basically forced Lukashenko's hand. You have to fulfill this obligation, bring the nukes back across our border. What I want to kind of end on in this discussion is, I think, the obvious blaring resonance of this episode, right? That President Putin has once again insisted that Belarus be a place where nuclear weapons are put. And on the one hand, there's been a kind of chorus of arguments about how this really doesn't matter and it doesn't change the strategic posture in Europe. But that episode from the 1990s, that is such a bizarre paradox, I think demonstrates to us in the present that this is part of a kind of tactic that Russia employs, right? And it demonstrates a kind of continuity in thinking about the political role of nuclear weapons, but also perhaps their strategic role, right? And even if you argue that Javier Solana's comment leading to that Founding Act that I mentioned, the stipulation in the Founding Act that the new members not have nuclear weapons on their territory, the Russian and Belarusian actors who orchestrated that kind of exchange, I think, have a case to believe that they won that concession. And so as we look at the picture now in Europe and where nuclear weapons are, and given the fact that President Putin has gone along once again in this pattern of suggesting they belong in Belarus, we should think carefully about whether an attempt to gain further concessions is in the works, or whether there is a kind of strategic framework behind that decision making. So, I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to discuss further any elements of this that people find interesting.
Okay, and our final speaker, J.B. Venable, is a former Air Force pilot, and he's now with the Heritage Foundation. He is the author of Breaking the Trust Barrier. Mr. Venable.
Thank you, Jeff. I can't stand behind a podium for whatever reason. Lots of years running from the law. I'm really not sure what it is. It's late in the day. I'm a little bit warm, and if I talk in just the right tone, I'll put myself to sleep. So I'm going to try not to do that in front of you. I'm going to run through a couple of slides, but before I do that, I want to thank Istvan and this lovely lady here and that guy right back there for putting on another incredible conference. Thank you. This is my third geopolitical summit. I was here for the one that took place in February of 2022. And what's notable about that is that was days, if not hours, right before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And in this forum, in this room, the last two presenters, the second to last had his last slide that said, it was a quote from Putin with a picture of Putin and said, Russia can take more punishment than the West can ever dole out. And that landed with me. And then the last guy got up, and everybody was tense because there was the massive buildup around Ukraine. And the last guy who was on teleconference said, don't worry, this is another bluff. Russia is not going to invade. And there was a big sigh of relief, and then Russia had invaded by the time I got back to the States. And so one of the things that's hard about predictions, it's really hard to make predictions, particularly about the future. And what I'm going to run through is where we are right now, looking at the old Cold War, where we are right now with what we think is the new Cold War, what the differences are, and maybe a course of action that we need to take as several different combined nations that come together under the NATO flag. The old Cold War, single geopolitical foe, very large, well-armed force, and we knew all about them. U.S. and allied military, crazy good. We were trained to the nines. I was part of the Cold War, 87 to 90, when the wall fell, and I could not tell you that we were more prepared. We were just crazy good at what we did. And the economic and industrial strength of the NATO partners, the United States, we were on pretty solid footing back then. As just a point of view, I'm a fighter pilot. I talk in small words and generally over a lot of whiskey. We don't have the whiskey here, and so one of the things I will tell you about my occupation is, if you feed me enough bananas, I can get good at just about anything. And back then, they gave us a lot of bananas in the sense of flying time. And so I would fly in 87, 88, and 89. I flew on the order of 350 hours a year in the F-16, over 200 sorties. We considered anybody below 200 hours at risk. We wouldn't take anybody to combat that got below 150 hours a year, no matter what their experience was, because they would be a detriment to the fighting force. They would be someone that you would hope would be whistling back behind you so that you knew that they went away, right? Well, my pleasure. But this is one where you sit back and you start going in this comparison thing, and we go into a different state. We were ready, and this is our political trading partners in 1980. Right? You can see the world is basically the Western-oriented, and China basically is its own internal closed society, more or less. But this was a happy place, and this is a really important economic picture because when we were healthy, we were healthy. The last part of this is we were unified. There were a couple of things that we had fights over. Glick'em, which is that ground launched strategic deterrent thing that we put in the field and that ruffled some feathers throughout Europe. But by and large, inside the United States loved being part of the United States. And you go to Germany, and Germans love being German, and they were proud of it. And Belgium and France and everybody across the board loved their nationalities, right? Loved their nation states. And this is such an important thing. We were tight. The world today is markedly different across the board. U.S. and allied military capability has frayed significantly. And when I tell you this, I will put it in fighter pilot terms. We scoffed at the Russians. We knew exactly how many flying hours they were getting. They were getting between 100 and 120 hours of flying time a year. We knew that if we went to war with them, there was a lot of them, and they had great surface-to-air missile systems, but we would be victorious, and we knew it. We lived it. Casualties, we expected those. Losses, we expected those. But we were King Kong in our own minds. The Russians were getting 120 hours a year, and we were getting over 300, averaging well above 200 hours a pilot. Today, the United States Air Force fighter pilots are getting less than 120 hours a year. And that's just the tip of the spear on how things have withered. Our capacity, our capability, and our readiness as far as the United States Air Force, and I would go into the other services too, but I know my Air Force well. We are in bad shape. And if we were to go and do another major regional contingency like Afghanistan or Syria, we could go in there and tower over those threats, which are really non-existent threats, right? As far as the Air Force goes, we were living above it. If you watch what's happening over Ukraine right now, there are no fourth-generation fighters flying over the front on either side. And that's because the surface-to-air missile systems are so good that you have to be flying in a fifth-generation fighter in order to be able to survive in that sense. And so now we've kind of gone back to trench warfare, 1918, 1917, 1916, because of our inability and Ukraine's inability to fly and employ over the front. Economic and industrial strength has withered. We heard great presentations today about what happened to the global economy, how the United States industrial capacity writ large has withered. And with it, so has the military-industrial complex, which is in a pretty interesting place right now. Unity inside the United States. School kids are being taught that the United States was based on bad origins, and we should not be proud of what we are as a United States. But we're not unique in that sense. You're starting to see this go across the West, and it's something that's very odd. You don't want to be proud of where you're from. If you look at the EU, there used to be pride in being German and being Belgium and being not Russian, but in being in Dutch. And this idea of being proud is kind of withered really significantly. Someone else is going to take care of us, right? The EU or the United States or something else, but that sense of that national pride. Well, nationalism, we heard the word a couple of times this morning, and I don't know about you, but I kind of recoiled when I heard it. And that makes me really have doubts about myself. Because when you utter the words nationalism, it is not a bad thing. It's something that we all ought to rebuild, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Multiple geopolitical foes. It's not just Russia. It's not just China. It's Iran. It's North Korea. And at least North Korea has those nuclear weapons that are so feared. And we have to be able to defend or take action on them. But let's go into one geopolitical foe, and that's China's military. Right now, China's military has surpassed the United States military with regard to ships. Their Navy is bigger than the United States Navy, and the United States Navy sails and sorties all over the world, right? And they're only focused primarily on that South China Sea and that region. And so their ability to dominate that with platforms is significant. But their fighter force is really coming along as well. And when I say this, it's the tip of the iceberg. There's so much underneath this. You have heard about Australian or British or some fighter pilot from around the world being found or discovered in China teaching them tactics from the West. The tactics are so very important and so very hard to develop. But if you're given those tactics, then you get the repetitions, you give your guys enough bananas, they get good at it, right? So let's go into flying hours. I told you about the United States flying hours. Between 100 and 120. F-35 pilots are getting around 80 hours a year, very low levels. And you go, well, there's simulators. No, that's a lie too. The guys are getting a simulator or two a month, and it's not enough in any way to compensate for the lack of flying time. China's pilots study out of Maxwell Air Force Base, the United States Air Force Center of Education and Training. A book was written, and you can find it online, and China's pilots are getting between 180 and 220 hours a year. And they are training to win, right? They're training to win. And so this is the new Cold War, right? This is where we are. And then you've got this trading thing, right? And this is today, or well, actually it's 2018 snapshot. And you can find this slide in the progression. It's a pretty cool thing on howmuch.net. But you can see that a lot of the world depends on China trade, right? A lot of the world depends on it. And how does that shape our alliances and our partnerships? Well, the United States has a bunch of allies and partnerships and military alliances that we're committed to it. You can see the list here, but let's just focus on the 31 nations within NATO. Amazing group. And this is the expenditures of NATO. And we talked about this a little bit, but this is the graphic. And the green line, you can see the green line. If a country's expenditures go above the green line, that's above 2% of GDP, their GDP. And you can see everybody below that doesn't meet that. And there's only, I think, 6 or 7 nations right now who meet that threshold. And what's important about that is they have given a lot of their material resources away to Ukraine. The military stockpiles of munitions and missiles have dwindled across Europe and across the United States. And this is what's going to refill them. And it's not adequate. We've got to bring that up to speed. As a snapshot, I showed this slide last year in Desert Storm, and this is not against a global peer. This is against a regional bully in Iraq. We dropped at 209,000 munitions. That averaged out for the war 5,200 munitions a day. That's how many the United States Air Force and its allies were dropping in the war. A different engagement when we went down and took out Muammar Gaddafi, this unified protector. We only dropped 7,600 munitions over the course of that war. And that turned out to be 36 munitions a day. But what's really startling about that is that this war started in March, at the end of March. In the first 2 weeks of April, many European nations were out of munitions. And they had to come to the United States and say, hey, can you give us some munitions? And so at the end of this, they did a lessons learned thing. The 2014 Wales Summit requirement to grow the stockpile of munitions across Europe so that everyone could feed from it. And this is what they have now, 4,365 munitions in their stockpile. So if it's a Desert Storm war and we have to tap into that, that's 0.8 days of munitions. That's not a full day of munitions against a regional thug, not against a global peer competitor. And so this is a serious issue, and we need to refill our stockpiles. Let's go into sentiment and this nationalism thought process. This is a snapshot from 2019, and the chart's a little bit hard to understand, but above the line, more than 50% of the people in those nations were willing to go and defend another NATO ally if Article 5 was invoked, right? This is pre-2022, right? Well, 2022 rolls around, and here is another, and this is a NATO survey. And here, everything left of the blue line changed. Everybody goes, hey, this threat is real over there with those doggone Russians. And so now, more than half, there's only a couple of nations that aren't above 50% that would be willing to fight for a peer, a NATO ally. And you've got the ads over here of Finland and Sweden, and they're awfully strong with regard to sentiment. So that's pretty healthy. But we've got a bigger problem in the United States because we also have to go into the Pacific. And if China was to go to take on Taiwan, this is the sentiment of Europeans of their willingness to go and support that war with the United States. And if it's red, it's neutral. If it's blue, they would support the United States. And you can see in this chart that almost everyone is below 50% on that. So this sentiment, this alliance, this thought process of us coming together has got to change. Another snapshot from our alliance in Japan, Australia, South Korea. But let's focus on Japan because they've been in the newspaper with regard to being declared by the Air Combat Commander, the 4-star in the United States, that says Japan is our #1 military ally with regard to strength and might and re-equipment in the Pacific. The #1. I had the opportunity to talk to 3 general officers, each of the services from Japan, and I said, hey, you're buying that F-35. That's great that you're refurbishing your kit. You've got Patriots, you've got THAAD. What's the depth of your magazine? And all 3 of them looked at the floor, and I said, how deep is your magazine? How many sorties? How many munitions? And they all looked at me and said, for the fighter force, 3 sorties worth of munitions. 3 sorties worth of munitions for their fleet of fighters. And that is, if you want to go into missiles on their ships, Patriot missiles and the likes, that's where we are right now with munitions. And to let you know what the Patriot situation is, Patriot missiles, really a good missile. Ukraine has a video where they fire 30 Patriot missiles in 30 seconds. And you watch them and they go and they brag about 29 of 30 hits. In that 30-second video clip, they fired 10% of the production capacity of the United States in Patriot missiles. And there is nobody else who produces Patriot missiles. The United States produces 300 a year. We're trying to get to 600 a year. But you can see in a fight, they go very fast.
We have to be up to 60 seconds. That would be great.
That'd be 60 seconds. That'd be great. So the new Cold War, we're back to the future in large measure with a couple of caveats. We're starting from a much lower point than we did at the end of World War II in Korea, when all of the nations, by and large, had militaries or were starting to build their militaries back up. Our economies are not good. The sentiment of nationalism is all but depleted as we go. And if you were to look at this, where we are really is not 1970, Back to the Future. We're 1935. And we're watching a nation at war within Europe right now. And part of that nation has been taken by another military. And there are people talking about saying, hey, you know, why don't we just draw the lines here and let them keep that? Let them appease Russia and try to broker a peace out of this. 1935, 1936, 1937. We did that with some of our European nations back then too. So what do we need to do? This is my thoughts. And this is not out of the realm of the possible. We need to rebuild our military capability, capacity, and readiness levels, and we need to be feared. We collectively need to be feared. And if you get to that point, then you put pause in Putin, and you put pause in Xi, and you give the opportunity for all of the other tools of government to actually really work. Build our stockpiles, military-industrial complex. Really good book out there called, I'm going to get the title wrong, Freedom's Forge. It's about how long it takes and how much it takes to actually fight a global conflict. Highly encourage you to read that. And then start believing in ourselves again. And this is really an odd statement. We need to start talking about what great nations we have and what great alliances we have. And if we can do that, if we actually start a public relations campaign that says, hey, you know, I was in Hungary and it's pretty awesome. And it's pretty safe to walk the streets there, and it's pretty wonderful to be around these people. go to the United States again and start rebuilding that belief in ourselves across our alliance. If we're able to do these things, ladies and gentlemen, then we'll keep Putin in check, and we'll keep Z from moving in a direction that he may or may not go. Is it 1935? Yeah, I'm with Yogi Berra on this. It's impossible to predict the future, but I do not want my children to have to face the consequences of that going into 1939 and 1940 and 1941. Thank you.
John, thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk. I had a very professorial question to finish the panel, but it's been a long day, and I learned long ago, quit on success. So thank you all very much. Thank you to the panel, and thank you all for being with us this long. We'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. And tomorrow there is so much more, but please make sure that you are here and seated by 9 a.m. for the opening remarks by Balázs Orbán, the political secretary to Viktor Orbán, the Prime Minister of Hungary. Thank you all. Enjoy your evenings and see you tomorrow.